The voice message lasted 41 seconds. I know because I played it 4 times, standing at my own kitchen sink with soapy water dripping from my hands onto the tile floor. And the counter on the screen said 041 every single time. It was a woman's voice. Low, warm, unhurried. The voice of someone who is very comfortable with the person she's calling. And she said, among other things, "I keep thinking about Saturday. Tell Emily you have another late client meeting. I'll be at the usual place by 7. She said his name the way you say the name of someone you've been saying it to for a long time. My husband's name. In my kitchen. From a phone that had fallen into the dishwater and woken up playing a message that was never supposed to exist in our house. By the time the message ended the 4th time, I had stopped dripping on the floor because I had stopped moving entirely. But that was a Tuesday evening in March. And to understand what Tuesday in March meant, I have to go back to before it. Back to when the kitchen smelled like the rosemary chicken I made on weeknights. And the biggest problem in my marriage was that Owen left his coffee cup on the wrong side of the sink. My name is Emily Hartwell, and I had been married to Owen Hartwell for 7 years when the dishwater delivered its verdict. We lived in a craftsman house in Raleigh, North Carolina, a 1930s house with crown molding and a kitchen that was too narrow for 2 people to pass each other comfortably, which had been a source of minor domestic comedy for all 7 years, and which I loved with a specific and rooted affection. The house was mine before Owen. I'd bought it at 29 with a down payment I'd saved over 4 years, working as a pediatric occupational therapist, in a job that required the specific combination of patience, precision, and the ability to hold a child's trust in your hands without squeezing too hard. I brought Owen into it when we married, and he'd moved into it the way he moved into most things, easily, with the natural comfort of a man who fits into spaces rather than filling them. Owen was a financial advisor at a mid-size firm in downtown Raleigh, good at his job in the particular way that people who are charming and organized tend to be good at things that require charming and organizing. He was tall and fair-haired and had a laugh that came from somewhere genuine, and he had, for most of our marriage, been a person I was glad to come home to. Our life had the texture of a life that works, routines that had found their own grooves without being negotiated into them, the particular ease of 2 people who have figured out each other's rhythms and stopped fighting them. I was at the clinic by 8 most mornings, working with kids between 3 and 12 on the fine motor and sensory processing challenges that their parents described with varying degrees of alarm and that I found, uniformly, manageable with the right approach and enough patience. Owen left at 8:30 and was usually home by 6:30, sometimes 7, occasionally later when a client meeting ran long. We took turns cooking. I cooked Tuesday and Thursday, he cooked Monday and Wednesday, weekends were improvised. We had a standing Friday dinner reservation at a Thai place 2 blocks from the house that we'd been going to for 5 years. We had friends we saw every few weeks, a small garden in the backyard that Owen maintained with more enthusiasm than skill, and a cat named Gable who disapproved of most things and communicated this through strategic placement of himself in whatever space you needed to occupy next. The dish I remember best from those years is the rosemary chicken. Not because it was complicated, it wasn't, but because it was the thing I made on Tuesdays when I wanted the house to smell like something good before Owen got home. And because the smell of rosemary and garlic in hot olive oil became, over years, a sensory shorthand for an ordinary evening in a house where I was content. I made it the Tuesday before the Tuesday that changed everything. Owen came home at 7, kissed my cheek, said it smelled incredible, and ate 2 portions with the uncomplicated appreciation of a man who had nothing pressing on his conscience. I know now that the Saturday before that Tuesday had been the Saturday the voice message was referring to. He'd told me he was at a client dinner in Cary, He'd been home by 10, smelling of restaurant food and a glass more wine than the situation apparently required. And he'd gone to bed and slept the untroubled sleep of someone who has been careful. I'd been at my sister Dana's house that Saturday, helping her pack for a move to Wilmington, and I'd come home to a quiet house and a husband in bed and thought nothing of it whatsoever. But I need to tell you about the small things first, because the small things matter, and because they always come before the large things. Always. And it's only in retrospect that they become readable. The first small thing happened in November, 4 months before the Dishwater Tuesday. First, Owen and I were watching something on television after dinner. I don't remember what, something neither of us was fully invested in. And his phone, on the armrest beside him, lit up with a text. He picked it up with the reflex of someone checking an expected message. And then the way he held it shifted. It was a tiny adjustment. The phone angled slightly away, the briefest tilt. And then he set it face down and said, without looking at me, "Work thing." I registered it the way you register a very faint smell that doesn't belong. Not strongly enough to name, not clearly enough to locate, just enough to notice and then file away under things that probably don't mean anything. I went back to the television. Gable walked across both of us on his way to somewhere more important. The evening continued, both of us. The second small thing was a Saturday in December when Owen came home from what he'd said was a morning at the gym, smelling not of sweat and the particular stale air of the fitness center he used, but of something else. Something that I noticed because I knew his post-gym smell the way you know all the domestic smells of a person you've shared a house with for years. His soap, his deodorant, the specific combination that meant Saturday gym. What I smelled instead, briefly, as he kissed my cheek in the kitchen doorway, was something that wasn't quite soap and wasn't quite his deodorant, but was slightly different from both, in the way that borrowed soap in someone else's bathroom is slightly different from your own. I stood at the kitchen counter after he went upstairs to shower, and I thought, he must have showered there. The gym has showers. This is unremarkable. I made coffee and went to read in the living room, and I didn't think about it again that day. But my body had filed it, the way bodies file things that the mind has decided to release. January brought a pattern I noticed only because I tracked schedules professionally. I work with children whose progress depends on consistent observation, and that habit of attention doesn't fully switch off when you leave the clinic. Owen's late evenings had increased in frequency. Not dramatically. This wasn't every night, nothing so obvious. But where October and November had averaged 2 late evenings a week, January had 3, sometimes 4. Client meetings, dinner with colleagues, a new account that required more FaceTime than the usual ones. He gave me these explanations with the easy fluency of a man who gives explanations often and has gotten good at giving them. And I accepted them with the trust of a woman who had no specific reason not to, and had built her marriage on a foundation of treating her husband as she herself wished to be treated. Fairly. With the benefit of the doubt. I'm not apologizing for this. I'm just describing it so you understand what it took to move me. The thing I should have paid more attention to, the one I can name now with the precision of someone who has had a long time to go back over the evidence, was a phone call I half overheard in February. I was coming downstairs from the bathroom and Owen was in the kitchen, voice low and quick, the particular register of a person who is trying to occupy less auditory space than usual. I caught 3 words clearly before he heard my footstep on the stairs, and the tone changed. Not this weekend. I heard just those 3 words, and then the transition, the voice shifting upward into the ordinary register. And when I came into the kitchen, he was saying something about rescheduling a golf game to someone whose name I didn't ask because the whole thing had lasted 4 seconds, and I had already decided, in those 4 seconds, that I was not the kind of wife who listened at stares. I poured myself a glass of water and asked about dinner, and the moment passed. I have thought about those 3 words, "not this weekend," more times than I can count. What he was rescheduling and for whom. Whether the weekend in question was a weekend when something else had happened instead. Whether "not this weekend" was said with regret or with practicality. I don't know the answer to any of those things, and I've stopped needing to. By March, I had developed what I can only describe as a low-grade atmospheric awareness of Owen that had not previously been part of our marriage. Not suspicion exactly, not anything I could articulate to myself or anyone else as a specific concern, but a form of heightened attention, the kind that operates below the level of conscious thought and manifests as a slight increase in noticing. I noticed when his phone went face down. I noticed the register of his voice when he came in from outside calls. I noticed that he had started showering before bed on nights when he'd been out. Not unusual in itself, but the frequency had increased in a way that the November gym incident had primed me to notice. None of these things individually crossed the threshold of something I was willing to name. Together, they had been building a pressure in the back of my mind that I kept releasing by reminding myself of all the evidence on the other side. 7 years, no previous reason for doubt, a husband who was present and affectionate and made dinner twice a week and maintained a garden badly and was, as far as I could see, the person I had married. And then came the Tuesday of the rosemary chicken. And after it, the Tuesday 8 days later when the dishwater woke the phone. It was a regular evening. I'd gotten home at 5:30, made the chicken again because we'd had it the previous week and Owen had said it was the best batch yet, which I'd noted with the particular pleasure of someone who takes small domestic satisfactions seriously. Owen had texted at 5 to say he'd be home by 6:30, and I'd texted back. And we'd had the brief, comfortable exchange of 2 people who know each other's schedules well enough to plan around them without effort. He arrived at 6:40, kissed me, poured himself a glass of water, asked about my day with the attention of someone who was genuinely interested, and I told him about the 6-year-old I'd been working with, who had today successfully buttoned 3 consecutive buttons for the first time, which, in the context of fine motor development, was a significant moment. Owen smiled in the way he did when he found something I'd described genuinely touching. It was a real smile, I'm certain of it, because I know his real smiles from his performed ones, and this was real, and said, "That's a big deal, Em." I said it was. We ate dinner. He told me about an account at work. We talked about whether we should do anything for Easter weekend. Gable knocked a glass off the counter for reasons known only to himself, and Owen caught it before it hit the floor, which was impressive and made us both laugh. And it was, to all appearances, an entirely ordinary evening in an entirely ordinary marriage. Owen's phone was on the counter beside the sink. He put it there when he came in most evenings, a habit of the kitchen, the way some people deposit keys and others deposit whatever's in their pockets. After dinner, he went to the living room to watch something while I cleaned up, which was our usual division on the nights I cooked. I cleaned. He set up the evening. I was washing the roasting pan, which required both hands and some effort because roasting pans always do, and at some point I reached for the dish brush on the other side of the sink, and my elbow connected with Owen's phone on the counter, and it went into the dishwater. Not dramatically. It just slid in, quiet as anything, and was underwater before I'd finished the motion that knocked it. I reached in immediately and pulled it out, and the screen was already dark in the way of a phone that has taken water, and I shook it and dried it on the dish towel and set it on the counter and thought, well, that's a problem, and Owen's going to need a new phone, or at least a bag of rice and some patience. And then the screen lit up. Not fully. It flickered. The uncertain light of a damaged phone trying to operate with compromised components. And then the speaker crackled with the sound of a voice message that had apparently been partially cued, or triggered by the water hitting the playback function. or some combination of the two that I have never fully understood technically, and stopped trying to understand because the technical explanation stopped mattering approximately 4 seconds in. The voice was a woman's. I said this already at the beginning, but let me tell you what it was like to actually hear it. It was warm, relaxed, the specific quality of ease in a person's voice when they are talking to someone they know very well and are not performing for. She said, "Hey, I know you're probably at dinner. I keep thinking about Saturday." There was a small pause, the pause of someone savoring something rather than searching for words. "Tell Emily you have another late client meeting. I'll be at the usual place by 7. I wanted to hear your voice." "Okay, call me when you can." The message ended. The screen flickered once more and went dark for good this time, the phone finally conceding the argument with the water. I stood at the kitchen sink with the dish towel in my hands and the roasting pan half washed and the dishwater still warm around my wrists and the kitchen smelling of rosemary and garlic. And I stood there long enough that the water began to cool. The refrigerator hummed the way it always hummed. Gable padded into the kitchen, looked at me with his habitual air of mild disapproval, and padded back out. From the living room, I could hear the low murmur of the television. From the counter, silence, where the phone had been, now just a rectangle of dark glass sitting in a small puddle of its own draining water. "Tell Emily you have another late client meeting." That was the sentence. Those 7 words. Not the, "I keep thinking about Saturday," and not the, "I wanted to hear your voice," as devastating as both of those were. It was those 7 words, the casual specificity of them, the way she'd said my name, Emily, without any weight, the way you say the name of someone who is a known quantity in a situation, an obstacle to be managed, a variable that has been accounted for. She hadn't said, "Tell your wife." She'd said my name. She knew my name, wife. She had used my name in the same breath as the instruction for how to lie to me. And she had said it with the ease of someone who had said it before, in that context, more than once. The plan was not new. The late client meetings were not a recent invention. Whatever Saturday she was thinking about was not the first Saturday. I dried my hands on the dish towel. I set it down on the counter. I looked at the dark phone for a moment, and then I walked to the kitchen doorway and looked into the living room where Owen was on the couch, with one arm behind his head and the television going, and Gable already repositioned against his leg. He looked comfortable. He looked like a man watching television after a pleasant dinner in his own house. He looked, from that doorway, exactly like the person I thought I was married to, and the distance between that appearance and what I had just heard in his own kitchen was so large and so sudden that the room tilted slightly around me. Not dizziness, nothing so simple, but the specific physical sensation of a world that has just become a different size than you thought it was. I gripped the doorframe. The wood was cool and solid and real. I breathed in through my nose. Rosemary, garlic, the faint electronic smell of a phone that had shorted out, and out through my mouth. Once, twice, 3 times. "Hey," Owen said without looking up. "Everything okay in there? I heard something fall." "The phone went in the sink," I said. My voice came out exactly as I needed it to. Even. Ordinary. The voice of a woman whose evening has had a minor domestic incident. "I think it's done." He sat up then and looked at me, and his face did the thing it does when he's registering a practical problem. The slight narrowing of the eyes, the forward lean of a man who was already calculating the solution. "Ah, damn. Was it already having issues, or—" "It just fell in," I said. I dried it off. It turned on for a second and then went dark. He got up and came to the kitchen, and I stepped aside to let him look at the phone. And he picked it up and pressed the side button and got nothing. and said, "Rice. Do we have rice?" I said yes, in the pantry. He got a container and buried the phone in it and said, 48 hours, usually. It might be okay. He set the container on the counter and looked at me with the easy frustration of a man dealing with an inconvenient but manageable problem. "I'll get a loaner from the store tomorrow if I need to make calls." "Okay," I said. He went back to the living room. I went back to the roasting pan. The water had gone cold. I finished the dishes with a thoroughness that surprised even me. Every dish, every pot, the counter wiped down, the stovetop cleaned, the sink rinsed, operating with the specific, focused efficiency of someone who needs to do something with their hands while their mind is elsewhere. My mind was not in the kitchen. My mind was in the message, going over it with the same careful, systematic attention I bring to a patient file, cataloging the details. The warmth in her voice, the familiarity of my name in her mouth, the phrase, "the usual place," the phrase, "another late client meeting," with its terrible small word, "another," implying a series, a pattern, a history of the same lie told multiple times and accepted each time by the wife at home in the kitchen. I thought about the November phone tilt. I thought about the December shower. I thought about "not this weekend" on the stairs in February. I thought about every late evening in January. And I thought about last Saturday when I was at Dana's helping pack boxes, and Owen was at a client dinner in Cary that had apparently been, instead, the usual place by 7. I did not go to the living room that night. I said I had a headache, which was not a lie, because by 9 o'clock my head was doing something specific and unpleasant that felt like pressure behind my eyes. And I went to bed. I lay in the dark, and I listened to the television murmur from downstairs, and I thought with a clarity that was almost frightening about what I knew and what I didn't know, and what I needed to find out before I said a single word to Owen. What I knew. There was a woman who knew my name and knew my husband's schedule and had a place they went on Saturdays and had previously arranged for him to come by, coordinating a false alibi. What I didn't know. How long? How serious? Whether there were others? Whether this was something that had an explanation that changed what it appeared to be. And I knew, even as I listed this last possibility, that I was listing it for completeness rather than because I genuinely believed it. A voice that warm and that comfortable and that casually possessive of my husband's Saturday evenings was not a voice with an innocent explanation. But I needed more than a voice message I'd already lost access to, because the phone was in a container of rice on the counter, and I had no idea if it would survive, or if the message would still be accessible if it did. I needed to know what I was actually dealing with before I moved. I didn't sleep. Owen came to bed at 11 and kissed my forehead in the dark and said, "Feeling any better?" And I said, "A little." And he settled in and was asleep in 12 minutes, and I lay beside him in the dark and listened to him breathe with the easy rhythm of a clear conscience, or of someone whose conscience has found a way to compartmentalize that I've never had access to. By 2 in the morning, I had made 3 decisions. The first, I was not going to say anything to Owen until I had documentation of what I'd heard and whatever else I could find. The second, I was going to call my friend Rachel in the morning because Rachel was pragmatic and kept her head and had been through something similar 4 years ago and had come out the other side with both her dignity and her financial settlement intact. The third, I was going to find out who the woman was. Morning came with the particular indignity of a Thursday that is required to look like an ordinary Thursday when it is not. Owen got up at 7:15, made coffee the way he always did. 2 cups, 1 for each of us. Left mine on the counter with the right amount of milk because he knew exactly how I took it after 7 years of knowing. and asked how my head was feeling. I said better. He said good. He checked the rice container, pressed the side button, got nothing, said he'd stop at the phone place on his lunch. He kissed me at the door at 8:20 and said he'd try to be home by 6:30. I watched his car back out of the driveway, and then I sat down at the kitchen table with my coffee, and I stared at the container of rice on the counter for a long time. I called Rachel from my car in the clinic parking lot at 8:55, before my first patient at 9. Rachel picked up on the second ring, which is what Rachel does, and I told her, in 3 minutes flat, because my 9 o'clock was a 7-year-old who had made real progress last week, and I owed her my full attention, what had happened the previous evening. Rachel was quiet for exactly 5 seconds, and then she said, "Okay, don't say anything to him yet, not until you know more. Do you still have access to the phone?" I said it was in rice. She said, "If it comes back it up to the cloud before he touches it, and call your sister." I said Dana was in the middle of a move. She said, "Call her anyway. She's your person. And Emily, document everything you remember from the message. Write it down now, word for word, while it's fresh." I said I would. She said, "You're going to be okay. I mean that." I said I knew. I don't know if I knew. I wrote the message down in a notes app on my own phone during the 5-minute gap between patients at 11 o'clock, sitting in my small office with the door closed and the muffled sounds of the clinic around me. I wrote it as close to verbatim as I could reconstruct. The exact words, the pauses, the tone, the specific phrase, "Tell Emily you have another late client meeting." The specific phrase, "The usual place, by 7. Writing it down made it more real in a way that was both necessary and terrible. The act of putting words on a screen, transforming the thing from something I'd heard into something I could read, something that existed outside my memory now and could not be revised or softened by the desire to have misheard. I read what I'd written twice. Then I went to see my 11:30 patient, a 4-year-old named Ben, who had the most focused attention for puzzles I'd seen in a child his age, and I spent 45 minutes in the entirely separate world of occupational therapy, and was, for those 45 minutes, nothing except useful. Owen's phone survived the rice. It came back Thursday evening while he was in the shower before dinner, and I was the one who found it lit on the counter. The screen uncertain but functioning. Some internal component apparently dried sufficiently to attempt operation. I had perhaps 6 minutes. I did what Rachel had told me to do. I went to the cloud backup settings and initiated a full backup. It took 4 of my 6 minutes. When Owen came downstairs, the phone was back in the rice container where he'd left it, and I was at the stove with my back to him, and the backup was running on a server somewhere. When he retrieved the phone himself an hour later and found it working, he was pleased. Rice works, who knew? And spent 20 minutes going through it to make sure everything was intact. I watched him from the couch, over the top of the book I was pretending to read, and he went through his messages with the practiced speed of a man looking for specific things and not finding the thing he was most relieved not to find. Because the thing he was most relieved not to find had been a voice message from a woman named, as I would discover the following day, Claire Weston. And it had played once in a water-damaged phone and been heard by exactly the person it was not meant for. And now it was backed up in a cloud that Owen didn't know I had access to. And I want to be careful here about how I describe what followed, because I did something that I would not, in any other circumstance, characterize as something I'm proud of, but that I am also not going to apologize for. I looked at the cloud backup. I looked at it on my own laptop on Friday afternoon while Owen was at work, logged into the shared account we'd set up years ago for joint photo storage, and that apparently also backed up app data from both phones when both phones were connected to the same network. I had not previously been aware of this functionality, and I suspect Owen had not thought about it when he'd set it up. I looked at the message thread first, because the cloud backup included messages, and because the voice message had given me a name in the contact, Claire. There were 63 text messages between Owen and Claire Weston going back 14 months. 14 months. The first one was a professional context. They had apparently met at a financial planning conference in Charlotte. And then there was a gap of 3 weeks. And then the professional context had dissolved into something else entirely, gradually and then quickly, the way these things apparently go. By month 3, the messages were unambiguous. By month 6, they had a pattern. Saturday evenings at a specific hotel bar in Cary called the Lantern Lounge. Occasionally Friday lunches at a place near her office. A system of cover stories that he had apparently found easy to generate and she had apparently found easy to receive. By the most recent messages, 3 days ago, they had been doing this for over a year, and the thing between them had the settled, comfortable quality of something that has found its own rhythm. Her messages had an ease and an ownership to them that was, in its way, more disturbing than anger would have been. She wrote about him as though she had a claim. In one message, 6 months back, she had written, "Do you ever think about what this would look like if it were just ours?" He had written back, "Sometimes. Not yet. Not yet." 2 words that lived in my chest like something sharp and immovable. I sat with the laptop open on the kitchen table for a long time after I finished reading. The house was quiet around me. Gable asleep on the chair in the corner, the refrigerator doing its usual thing, afternoon light through the kitchen window falling in a rectangle on the floor the way it always did at this time of day, indifferent to context. I thought about not yet. I thought about 14 months of Saturdays and Friday lunches and cover stories, and my name in Claire Weston's mouth as a variable to be managed. I thought about the rosemary chicken, and Owen eating 2 portions and saying it was the best batch yet. And I thought about what he'd been doing the Saturday before that dinner. The rectangle of light on the floor moved slightly as the sun shifted. Gable stretched in his chair. Outside, a car passed on the street. Everything was exactly as it always was, and absolutely nothing was the same. I called Dana that evening. Dana, who was surrounded by boxes in a half-unpacked apartment in Wilmington, who picked up on the first ring because she'd been waiting for me to call since Rachel had apparently texted her, which I did not know Rachel had done and which I chose to be grateful for rather than annoyed by. I told her everything in one long account, and she was quiet through all of it. And when I finished, she said, "Where are you right now?" I said, "Home." Owen wasn't back yet. She said, "Okay, I need you to listen to me. Do not confront him tonight. I know you want to. Don't." I said I knew. She said, "Do you have a lawyer?" I said no. She said, "You need one before you do anything else." No, I have a name. A woman in Raleigh. Her name is Janet Morse. She does exactly this kind of thing, and she's very, very good. I'll text you her number right now. The text came through while we were still on the phone. Dana said, "Call her Monday." And M? The house. I said, "I know." She said, "Make sure you know what you have. Make sure you know what's yours." I said I would. She said, "I love you." I said I knew that too. When we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table in the dark. I'd forgotten to turn on the lights as the afternoon light faded. And I held the phone in both hands and breathed. And the breathing was the only thing I was sure of. Owen came home at 7 on Friday with takeout from a place we liked, which was a gesture of the kind that I now understood with an entirely new precision. He set it on the counter and said, "You seemed off this week. I thought I'd bring reinforcements. And he said it with the specific warmth of a man who is attentive to his wife's moods and responds to them with consideration. And I thought, he's not performing this. He genuinely noticed. He genuinely cares. He has been doing both of these things simultaneously for 14 months, caring about me and being somewhere else on Saturdays. And he has held both without apparent difficulty, which was its own kind of information about who he was and how much of him I actually knew. I said thank you and got plates, and we ate and talked about Dana's move and a patient of mine who'd had a breakthrough. And Owen was interested and present, and I kept my face exactly as it needed to be, which took more from me than anything I'd done in a long time. Saturday morning, he told me he had a client meeting in Cary at 6. I said okay. He said he wasn't sure how long it would run. 6. I said I'd probably have dinner with Rachel. He nodded with the ease of a man who has just received the information that his evening is unobstructed. He left at 5:30, kissed me at the door, drove away. I watched the car disappear around the corner, and then I went back inside, and I sat on the couch with Gable in my lap and the quiet house around me, and I let myself feel it. All of it. The full weight of 14 months and 63 messages, and not yet, and my name in her mouth. And I cried for 20 minutes in a way I hadn't let myself cry all week. The kind of crying that is not grief exactly, but is the body releasing the pressure of carrying something very heavy while pretending it weighs nothing. Gable endured it with his customary dignity and occasional concerned assessment of my face. When it was over, I washed my face and made tea and sat at the kitchen table. And the crying had done what crying sometimes does. It had cleared something, made room for something that was harder and quieter and more useful. I picked up my phone. I called Rachel. I said, I'm ready to move forward. What do I do first? She said, Monday, call Janet Morse. Tonight, you eat dinner with me, and you don't spend Saturday alone in that house. I said, okay. She came over at 7 with wine and pasta from her own kitchen, and we sat at my table, the table where I'd looked at the cloud backup, and we talked about everything except Owen for 2 hours, which was exactly what I needed. Monday morning, I called Janet Morse from the clinic parking lot at 8:45. Her assistant said she had a cancellation Thursday at 11, and could I make that work? I said yes. I spent the days between Monday and Thursday in the specific discipline of a woman who knows something and is not yet acting on it. Ordinary in every visible way, present at the clinic, present at home, giving Owen nothing that indicated the ground had changed. He was, during those days, himself. Attentive, easy, making dinner Wednesday night with the cheerful competence of a man who has found a recipe that works and deploys it reliably. I watched him cook and thought about Janet Morse's office, and thought about the cloud backup on my laptop, and thought about the word another in a woman's voice message. And I kept my face the way I needed it to be. Thursday at 11. I was sitting in Janet Morse's office on the second floor of a building on Hillsborough Street, in a chair across from a woman in her late 40s who had the specific quality of having heard everything and retained the capacity to be precise about all of it without being moved by any of it in ways that would impede her function. She had good posture and clear eyes and a yellow legal pad in front of her that she did not look at while I talked. I laid out everything. The voice message, the cloud backup, the 63 messages, the 14 months, the Saturday pattern, the phrase, not yet. She listened without expression. When I finished, she picked up her pen and said, the house. I said it was mine, bought before the marriage, in my name. She nodded, wrote something. Joint accounts? I listed them. she wrote. His income relative to yours? I gave her the approximate numbers. She wrote. Then she looked up and said, with the directness of a woman who respects the intelligence of the person across from her, you have a solid foundation. The house is separate property and is well documented. The joint assets will go through equitable distribution. If you have evidence of marital misconduct, which you do, and it's on a cloud server, which is better than a screenshot, that's relevant to how a judge weighs certain factors. She paused. What do you want to do? I want to know what I have before I decide what to do with it, I said. She nodded. Good answer. Come back next Thursday. I want my paralegal to go through the financial documents with you in detail, and I want a copy of the backup data. She looked at me steadily across her desk. Whatever you decide, whether you want to try to work through this with your husband or whether you want to file, you'll make a better decision with a complete picture. She said the phrase complete picture with the measured certainty of someone who has seen what happens when people act on an incomplete one, and I thought, yes, that is exactly what I need. The complete picture took 10 more days to assemble. Some of it I found myself, going back through the cloud backup with a systematic attention that I think surprised even me. Dates, times, locations cross-referenced against Owen's stated whereabouts on those same dates. The alignment of his cover stories with the actual documented events, creating a map of the last 14 months that was, when finished, comprehensive and irrefutable. Some of it came from a source I didn't expect. My neighbor Patricia, a retired middle school teacher who lived 2 doors down and walked her corgi past our house every evening at 6, had been, as it turned out, holding something for a while. She came to my door on a Thursday evening, which was unusual enough that I knew before I opened the door that it was deliberate. And she said, with the directness of a woman who has decided something and executed the decision, I've been seeing a woman park on the street and go into your backyard through the side gate when you're not home. 3 times in the last 2 months. Red Honda Civic. I wrote down the license plate because I didn't know what else to do with it. She handed me a piece of paper, the plate number written in her careful teacher's handwriting. I didn't know if I should say anything. I decided I should. I looked at the paper. I said, "Thank you, Patricia." She nodded once, with the expression of a woman who has done something difficult and is glad it's done, and went back to her corgi and her evening. I gave the license plate to Janet Morse, who had a contact, and by the following Tuesday had a name and address. Claire Weston, 31, financial planner at a firm in Cary. The Honda Civic was hers. She had been in my backyard, my house, the house I'd bought at 29 with 4 years of savings, the house Owen had moved into when I married him, at least 3 times when I wasn't home, which meant Owen had let her in, which meant the key I'd given him had been used for purposes I hadn't consented to, which was the piece of information that moved me from sadness into something colder and considerably more purposeful. I am an occupational therapist. I work with the principle that the goal is not to eliminate the obstacle, but to build around it with skill and intention. I had spent 2 weeks building. I was now ready to move. I planned the confrontation the way I plan a treatment session, with clear objectives, a defined sequence, knowledge of who would be in the room and what each person's likely response would be, and a specific outcome I was working toward. The outcome I was working toward was not drama. It was not punishment exactly. It was the truth, spoken clearly, in front of witnesses, with documentation, in a way that left no room for renegotiation or reframing. I called Owen's mother, Carol, on a Wednesday afternoon. Carol and I had a genuine relationship. She'd embraced me from the beginning with a warmth that I'd always believed was authentic, and that I still believe was authentic, which made the call both easier and harder. I told her I needed to talk to her about something serious before I talked to Owen, and she went very quiet in the way that mothers go quiet when they understand that they're about to receive information they can't unreceive. And she said she'd come on Saturday. I said yes. Saturday was, after all, the day Owen had a standing appointment elsewhere. I also called Dana, who drove 4 hours from Wilmington on Saturday morning and arrived at my door at 10 o'clock with her overnight bag and the specific expression of a woman who has shown up for her sister the way sisters are supposed to show up. We sat at the kitchen table with coffee while I went through everything: the backup, the timeline, the license plate, Janet's assessment, and Dana listened with the focused attention she always brought to things that mattered. And when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You're ready." I said I thought so. She said, "You're sure about Carol?" I said I was. Dana said, "Okay, then let's make sure you have everything you need." Owen came home at 7:15 that Saturday, which was slightly later than 7, and he came in with the particular looseness of a man who has had a pleasant evening and is now returning to the comfortable life that runs parallel to it. He set his keys on the counter where his phone had fallen into the dishwater 3 weeks ago, the counter where the rice container had sat, the counter where the full weight of this had begun, and turned to find me sitting at the kitchen table. Then he registered that the kitchen table had other people at it. Dana, on my left, with her hands around a mug and her face absolutely neutral. Carol, on my right, with an expression that I knew cost her something to maintain. She'd been in this house for 3 hours, and I'd told her everything. And Carol was a woman who loved her son and also believed in truth. And the collision of those two things was visible in her face in a way that I wasn't going to make her hide. Janet Morse was not present physically, but the folder on the table in front of me, printed documentation, organized by date, 47 pages, was present for her. Owen looked at the table. He looked at his mother. He looked at me. The color in his face underwent a specific change that had nothing to do with the kitchen light. He put his keys back down on the counter with a deliberateness that was the only controlled thing about him in that moment. "Owen," I said, with a quietness that came from somewhere I'd been building toward for 3 weeks. "Sit down." He sat. He sat in the chair across from me, the chair where he'd sat for 7 years of breakfasts and dinners and ordinary evenings, and he looked at me with an expression that was searching for something to say and not finding it. "I'm going to tell you what I know," I said, "and then I'm going to tell you what I've decided, and then I'm going to let you respond, okay?" He said nothing. His jaw moved once. "I know about Claire Weston," I said. "I know about the Lantern Lounge on Saturdays. I know about the Friday lunches. I know about the 14 months. I placed my hand on the folder without opening it. I have the message thread. All of it. I have the backup from the cloud account we both use." I paused, watching his face go through things I had expected and things I hadn't. "I know she's been in this house when I wasn't home. I have the dates." Another pause. "I know about not yet." The kitchen was absolutely silent. The refrigerator hummed. Gable, who had been in his chair in the corner, dropped silently to the floor and left the room, which was perhaps the most eloquent thing anyone did in that moment. Carol, beside me, had both hands flat on the table and was looking at her son with an expression that said everything she wasn't going to say out loud, because she was here as a witness to my truth-telling, not as a participant in her own, and she understood that distinction and maintained it with a dignity I appreciated then and appreciate more now. Owen looked at the folder. He looked at me. His mouth opened and then closed. And then he said, in a voice that had lost most of its shape, "I'm not finished," I said, with the same quiet. "I've met with an attorney. The house is mine. Separate property, clear documentation. The joint accounts are a different conversation, and we'll have it through counsel. What I'm telling you tonight is that I know, I have proof, and I'm filing for legal separation on Monday. I looked at him steadily across the table we'd shared for 7 years. You can stay through the end of the week. After that, I need you to make other arrangements. Owen looked at his mother. Carol looked at her son with the specific expression of a woman who has decided that love and accountability are not, in this moment, mutually exclusive. She said, quietly, "She's right, Owen." 2 words from his mother, spoken without inflection. He looked back at me, and what I saw in his face was not the anger I'd braced for, and not the denial I'd half expected, but something I hadn't anticipated. Recognition. The specific expression of a person who has been found out and who has, somewhere underneath the shock and the calculation, been expecting to be found out, and who is now confronting the version of themselves they have been carefully not looking at. "I'm sorry," he said. The words came out stripped, without architecture, the way words come when someone has run out of performance and is left with the base material. "I know," I said. "But sorry doesn't change what I know or what I've decided." He left the table. He went upstairs. Dana put her hand over mine on the table and didn't say anything. Carol sat very still beside me with her hands flat on the table, and after a moment, she said, "I'm sorry, Emily, for all of it." I said I knew she meant it. She said, "What do you need?" I said, "I think I just need tonight to be over." She nodded. She got up and made tea, because Carol makes tea when she doesn't know what else to do, and the 3 of us sat at the kitchen table while the house settled around us into a quiet that was different from all the previous quiet it had held. And I drank the tea and let the evening finish itself. Owen left on Thursday. He took his clothes, his books, his golf clubs, the record player he'd brought into the marriage, and the specific detritus of a person's daily life, toiletries, chargers, the things that accumulate in the particular spaces a person inhabits over 7 years. He did not take anything that was mine before the marriage. He was efficient about it, in the way that people are efficient when they have lost the standing to negotiate. And he was quiet, and when he was done, he stood in the kitchen doorway with his last bag, and he looked at me with the expression I've thought about since and said, "I know I don't have the right to ask you anything." I said that was correct. He said, "Take care of yourself." I said I intended to. He left, the door closed. Gable came into the kitchen, stepped through the empty space where Owen's bag had been sitting, sniffed the floor, and went to his bowl. Life, with its characteristic indifference to drama, continued. The separation process was 6 months long, handled almost entirely through Janet Morse and Owen's attorney, and I won't go through all of it because the legal process, while important, is not the most important part of what happened. What I will tell you is that the house was confirmed as separate property without dispute. Owen's attorney did not challenge it, because the documentation was clean and the challenge would have failed, and that the joint accounts were divided equitably, and that I came out of the process with what was mine and a fair portion of what we'd built together, and that Janet Morse was worth every dollar of her billing rate. Owen settled into an apartment in the 5 Points neighborhood, a 2-bedroom that I learned about through mutual friends without seeking the information, and he and Claire Weston apparently did not maintain their arrangement into the post-discovery period, which I also learned through the same route, and which I held without particular feeling, because what happened between Owen and Claire after the kitchen table was no longer something I had any investment in. My sister Dana finished unpacking in Wilmington and called me every Sunday morning, which had always been her habit, and which I'd sometimes let slide when the weekends were full and busy and ordinary. Now I answered every Sunday without fail, because the Sunday calls had become something else. Not just catching up, but a kind of weekly confirmation that we were both still here, still in each other's lives, still the people we'd been before any of this. We talked about her new job, about my patients, about whether I was eating properly. She always asked. I always said yes. She never fully believed me and was always partially right. In March, 6 months after Owen left, she drove up and we went to the farmer's market and had lunch at the Thai place on the corner that had been mine and Owen's standing Friday reservation for 5 years, and which I had avoided for 6 months, and now went back to with deliberate intention, because avoiding a Thai restaurant for the rest of my life because of my marriage seemed like the wrong distribution of consequences. What I noticed in those months was the kitchen. Not dramatically, not as a scene of anything, just as a room. The narrowness of it, the crown molding, the afternoon light in its rectangle on the floor. I cooked rosemary chicken on Tuesdays because it was mine before it was ours, and it was going to remain mine after, and the smell of it filled the house the same way it always had, and Gable expressed the same opinion of poultry that he'd always expressed, which was principled indifference. I had the locks changed, which was practical and necessary, and also felt, when it was done, like something more than practical. The locksmith handed me 2 keys on a plain ring. Just 2, 1 spare, both new. I hung one by the back door where we'd always hung keys. The other I put on my keychain, next to my clinic key, the same ring I'd had since before I owned this house. 2 new keys for one old house that was unambiguously, documented and legally mine. In April, almost exactly a year after the cloud backup, and 6 months after the kitchen table confrontation, I was doing the dishes on a Tuesday evening. Rosemary chicken in the pan, Gable asleep in his chair, the radio playing something low. I'd started keeping the radio on in the kitchen during the months alone, because the house without it was quieter than I wanted. I was washing the roasting pan, both hands in the soapy water, and my phone was on the counter beside the sink. My phone, in a case that I'd bought myself in a color I'd chosen without consulting anyone, and it buzzed with a text from Dana. A photograph. Her new backyard in Wilmington. First flowers of spring coming up through what had been bare ground when she'd moved in. No caption, just the photograph of something that had pushed through the cold into the light because it was time. I dried my hands. I looked at the photograph for a moment. Then I texted back a single word. Beautiful. I set the phone back on the counter, face up, where I could see it. I went back to the pan. The radio played. The kitchen smelled like rosemary and garlic and olive oil and the particular warmth of a house where someone is alone and is fine with it. Gable shifted in his chair. Outside, the April evening was doing something generous with the last of the light. I washed the pan slowly, not rushing, and when I was done, I dried my hands on the dish towel and I turned off the tap. And the kitchen was quiet in the way that kitchens are quiet when they belong to you, and only you. And the quiet is entirely without weight.